So let's tackle our list of users next. Now, the first important question is where do we want to output it? And the second question that depends on the first one is where we then actually want to manage our list of users. So where do we want to output that list? We get the user data here in the add user component, and technically we could simply add more HTML code in that component to also render a list. Maybe here, unordered list below the form. We could then manage our list of users with use state in here in add user and output it down there. That is something we could do, and technically that would absolutely work. But by the way I'm saying this, you already hear that this is probably not how we're going to do it. The idea in React really is that you work with a bunch of components, that you have small, isolated pieces of HTML code and logic where every component really has its own task, its own responsibility, you could say. And therefore, you want to keep your components small and focused. You could certainly argue that a component that fetches user input and then outputs this as a list is focused enough, but I would argue that it's better to have one component that fetches user input. That's this add user component, which we already have. And then we have another component that is responsible for outputting the list of users, so that we split the outputting and the fetching logic into two different components. And therefore, I'll add a brand new component, the users list component, like this. And here, the users list component should be responsible for, well, outputting my user data. Therefore, in there, of course, we're going to write a React component. So let's import React from React so that we can use JSX code. And then here we have users list. We get our props here. And we, of course, export our component here so that we can use it in other files. And then here, I want to, in the end, return an unordered list where I want to go through a list of users, which I, well, need to get in some way, and output a couple of list items for every user. So one list item for every user. How should this work? Well, I think it makes sense to assume that in the users list component, we rely on props to get our actual array of users as data. So here between the unordered list, we could actually use props, let's say users. It's your component, so it's up to you which prop name you expect here. I expect to have a prop property which is named users, and that should hold an array of user data. So we can use the map method, which you learned about in the lists and conditionals module, to map that array of users to an array of JSX elements. So to transform our user data to JSX elements, which then are rendered onto the DOM. So map executes a function on every item in the user's array, and we'll get that item as an input. Since it's an array of users, I'll name that single item user and write an anonymous arrow function here. And then in this anonymous arrow function, we return a JSX element for every user of that user's array we expect to get on this prop. So the element, the JSX element which I want to render, is simply a list item here. And inside of that list item, I want to output the user name. Let's say we expect user to be an object with a name property. Then we could do it like this. And then thereafter, maybe in parentheses, and that's just text here, not a special React syntax. So between this parentheses text, I want to output, let's say, user.age years old. So my expectation here is that users is an array of user objects where every object has a name property and an age property. Why can I expect this? Because we're the ones creating this app. It's up to us to decide how we want to manage our data, and I want to manage an array of user objects where every object has a name property and an age property. So with that, we have the logic in place to output our users. Some styling would be nice, and for that, I first of all will wrap this list in a card. So I want to have that card component look here as well. So I'll import card again from UI card. And we need to import it here, even though we already imported it in add user, because you need to import what you want to use in a certain component into every component where you want to use it. So it's not enough to just import card once in another component. You need to import it in every component where you want to use the card. With that, we can use card here to wrap the unordered list. And now I also want to have some styling. And for that, you find a users list.module.css file attached, which you can just drag and drop into your users folder. And from there, you know the game, we can import classes from users list.module.css to use that CSS modules feature. And then here on the card, I'll add the class name prop, which I can because a few lectures ago, we made sure that we utilize our incoming class name prop here inside of the card. So we can set it here, we can set that prop, and I set it to classes.user to have not just the default card class on that card component, but also my special user class. Excuse me, users, not user. With that, we got a users list component. Now we need to use it. And that leads us to the next question. Where do we want to use this brand new component? We could use it here in add user. We could use it here below the form, users list like this. We just have to add an import, and we could use it there. That would be fine, but I don't think it makes sense. It's the add user component. If some other developer would have written this component and you would need to use it in your application, would you expect that this component does not just fetch the data and add it, but that it also outputs the user data? By the name add user, it doesn't sound to me like it's going to output anything. It's just about adding something, about getting some data to add something like that. So whilst you again could technically render it here, I think it logically makes more sense to include it somewhere else. And in case you're now wondering how you should decide where to render it, it's your app in the end. You can render things where you want. You can structure your app in the way you want, and the more you work with React, the more you will get a feeling for common patterns and practices. In this course, you will also learn a lot about that and of course see a lot of examples. Here, I want to render the users list in the app component, because that's also where I use add user. So to me, it makes sense that we then have users list here as a component next to add user. So we build our app here. We first have the block for getting that user data. Then we have the block for outputting the user. And below that, we might have other parts in the app, like a footer or something like that. Now to use that users list component here, we need to import users list from /components users list like this. And now we can use it, though it won't work. And actually, whilst we don't get an error here, we do see an error here. Cannot read property map of undefined. Now I told you not to panic when you see an error message, so let's see what's the problem here. It points us at the users list component, line 9, and it shows us the code snippet that's the problem. Here, it's in the end where we call map on the user's prop. This fails because map does not exist on undefined. What does this tell us? It tells us that in the users list component, here, users doesn't seem to be an array, it seems to be undefined. And undefined, of course, is a value type in JavaScript. And indeed, undefined, this value type doesn't have a map method. That is correct. You can't map undefined. Now, why is users undefined? Because in the place where we use users list, so in the app component, we're not setting that user's prop. Keep in mind, I'm extracting users from props. So I expect to get that user's data, that array in the end, on a user's prop on my users list component. So when I use this component in JSX, when I use it as a regular HTML tag in the end, I need to set that user's prop Or I need to include a check here where I check whether it's undefined and I don't even try to map it. That would be an alternative. But here I of course always want to set it. So in app.js we need to set the users prop, and this has to be users because that's the name we are retrieving here. If you picked a different name here, you need to pick a different name here too. But I'm working with users, and we need to set this to an array. And for now, an empty array, of course, does the trick. With that, we don't see a list, but we also don't see an error, and we at least see the card where the list will eventually be rendered. That was a huge step forward. Now let's make sure we actually manage a list of users.